In the 1800s, they found weapons that don't match any human who was supposed to use them. At first, that doesn't sound unusual. Old weapons are found all the time. Swords, axes, fragments buried in the ground, remains of conflicts, forgotten storage, things left behind. But the moment you actually look at some of these pieces, something feels off. Not in a dramatic way, in a very simple physical way. The size doesn't sit right. A blade that stretches far beyond what a person could comfortably control. A handle that looks slightly too thick the moment you imagine wrapping your hand around it. Not just large for effect, but large in a way that changes how the object would function. And that's where the difference begins. Because weapons aren't just built to exist, they're built to be used. Every part of them, length, weight, grip, is shaped around what a human body can actually manage. So when you come across something that clearly ignores those limits, you don't just see a big weapon, you see something that doesn't match the body it's supposed to belong to. And what makes it harder to dismiss is how quickly this stops being a single example. You don't just find one oversized blade and move on. You start noticing another, then another. Different styles, different regions, different time periods, but the same kind of proportion keeps showing up. Slightly longer than expected, slightly heavier than it should be, just enough to feel wrong, even before you try to explain it. And once that pattern starts forming, the question changes. It's no longer about one unusual object. It becomes about why this kind of mismatch appears more than once, in places that have no reason to be connected. Because if this were just exaggeration, you would expect randomness. But this doesn't look random, it looks consistent. And consistency is where things stop being easy to ignore. Once you start noticing that pattern in weapons, it becomes difficult to ignore. But what's more interesting is what happens when you stop looking only at weapons. Because the same kind of mismatch doesn't stay in one category. You begin to see it in completely different places. At first, it doesn't even feel related, just landscapes, rock formations, unusual shapes in nature that people have pointed out for years. But then you start looking at them the same way you looked at those weapons, in terms of proportion, in terms of scale, and something familiar shows up again. Massive vertical formations that rise far beyond what you'd expect from normal growth patterns. Flat surfaces that look less like erosion and more like something that ended abruptly. Bases that feel oversized compared to what sits above them. Individually, none of that proves anything. Just like one oversized weapon doesn't prove anything. But the similarity isn't in the object itself. It's in the way the proportions feel slightly off from what you expect. And that's where the connection begins. Not as a claim, but as a comparison. In both cases, you're looking at something that exists physically, but doesn't quite align with the scale you're used to seeing. And once you look at both through the same lens, weapons on one side, formations on the other, the question shifts again. Not what is this, but why does the same kind of size mismatch show up in completely different things? Once you see that similarity, you can't really unsee it. Because now it's not just about weapons anymore. You start going back and looking at those formations again, but this time, you're not just seeing shapes, you're looking at scale, and suddenly, something feels familiar. The same way a weapon looked slightly too large for a human hand. Some of these structures feel slightly too large for what we're told they are. Not in a crazy way, just enough to feel off. A base that looks heavier than it should be. A vertical rise that feels too clean, too straight. Edges that don't look completely natural. And the more examples you see, the more that feeling builds. Because it's not one place, it shows up again and again. Different locations, same kind of, this doesn't quite match feeling. And that's where it starts getting interesting. Because now you're looking at two completely different things. Weapons on one side, formations on the other. But both seem to follow a slightly larger scale than expected. Not massively different, just enough to stand out. And that kind of pattern is hard to ignore. Because random things don't usually feel the same way. But this does. But the moment you look closer, the problem isn't just the size of the weapons, it's what that size implies. Because a weapon isn't designed in isolation. It's built for a hand, for a body, for movement. So when the grip is thicker than a normal hand can close around, when the reach pushes past what a human body can control, you're not just looking at an oversized object, you're looking at something that doesn't match the user it was made for. And that's where the question shifts. Not, why is this weapon big? But who was it actually built to fit? Because if you take the proportions seriously, they don't line up with an average human frame. They line up with something larger, not dramatically, not in a way that looks like fantasy, but enough to change everything. And what makes that harder to ignore is the fact that this idea doesn't only exist here, because alongside these objects, there are records, scattered, inconsistent, but repeating, mentions of unusually large skeletal remains, accounts that describe human figures that don't fit typical height ranges. Nothing clean, nothing officially agreed on, but enough that the idea keeps resurfacing. And when you place that next to the weapons, it starts to feel less like two separate topics and more like two pieces of the same problem. Because now you're not just looking at objects that don't match human proportions, you're looking at objects and reports, both pointing in the same direction, a slightly larger scale than what we're used to. And once that connection forms, even loosely, it becomes harder to go back to seeing these weapons as just oversized decorations, because now they don't just look too big, they start to look correctly sized for something else. And once you start looking at it that way, the pattern doesn't stay limited to weapons, or even to human remains. It shows up in places people usually don't question at all, because most people don't look at landscapes the same way they look at objects. Why? They don't compare proportions. They don't think in terms of scale. But the moment you do, something starts to feel familiar again. You see formations that rise far beyond what you expect from normal growth. Not just tall, but shaped in a way that feels unusually controlled. Wide bases, clean vertical lines, flat upper sections that don't look like they gradually formed, but like something stopped. And on their own, those details don't mean much. They've always been there. People have seen them for years. But now you're not looking at them on their own anymore. You're comparing them to something else. To the same kind of size mismatch you saw in the weapons. To the same kind of proportion shift that didn't match a normal human body. And suddenly, it's not just one category showing that pattern. It's multiple. Weapons that feel built for a larger grip. Reports of bodies that don't match expected height. And now structures that seem to follow that same extended scale. Not identical, but similar enough that the direction is hard to ignore. Because now the pattern isn't isolated. It's repeating across completely different things. And when something shows up in objects, in human proportions, and even in the landscape itself, it stops feeling like coincidence. It starts feeling like everything is leaning slightly in the same direction. A direction that doesn't fully match what we're used to calling normal scale. By the time you step back and look at all of it together, the pattern is already there. It doesn't come from one object. It doesn't come from one place. And it doesn't depend on one explanation. You have weapons that don't match the proportions of a normal human body. Not slightly off, but consistently larger in the same way. You have physical details that suggest those objects weren't just made, but handled, used, interacted with. You have scattered reports across different times, describing human remains that don't quite fit within expected height ranges. Not clean evidence, not fully accepted, but present enough that the idea never completely disappears. And then you have something people rarely question at all, the landscape itself. Massive formations that follow similar patterns of scale, structures that feel heavier at the base than they should be, vertical rises that seem too controlled, shapes that don't always look like they developed gradually. Each one of these, on its own, can be explained. That part is important. There are reasonable explanations for oversized weapons. There are reasons why stories about unusual human size appear in history, and there are natural processes that can create formations that look unusual. But the question isn't about any single example, it's about what happens when you place them next to each other. Because now you're not dealing with one category, you're looking at objects, human proportions, and large-scale structures, all showing a similar kind of shift in size. Not identical, not perfectly aligned, but leaning in the same direction. Slightly larger than expected, slightly outside what we normally accept as standard. And that's where the real issue sits. Because coincidence can explain one thing. It can even explain two. But when the same kind of mismatch appears across completely different areas, it becomes harder to treat all of it as unrelated. That doesn't mean there's a single answer waiting behind it. It doesn't prove a specific theory, but it does leave a gap. A gap between what we expect to see and what actually shows up. And that gap doesn't disappear just because we move on from it. It stays there, in the objects, in the patterns, in the scale. So the question isn't about jumping to a conclusion. It's about recognizing that something doesn't fully line up. And once you see that clearly, it becomes very difficult to go back to seeing all of this as completely normal.